Hello, dear friends. My name is Vasil Pekhnyo. I'm a Ukrainian journalist who is covering the actually battlefield situation on Ukrainian battleground during the whole period of full-scale war. And right now, I propose to all of you to watch this latest update on Ukrainian battle map situation as of August the 25th. So like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave your comments just below the video. I will start with some good news about the weekend because Ukrainian armed forces, we had some positive dynamic. I will tell about this dynamic right now. So let's begin.
So, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, was, at least according to his own reports, working over the weekend in the Dobropilya and Pokrovsk directions on the Donetsk front, where he presented awards to our soldiers who distinguished themselves in the defense of this very difficult sector. You see, he visited the positions of the 155th Separate Mechanized Brigade named after Anna of Kiev, which, as is known, has been defending the Pokrovsk direction with all its challenges since its formation. This brigade is carrying out its tasks selflessly and honorably on what is truly the most difficult section of the front. Accordingly, yesterday, following his work on the Dobropilya and Pokrovsk directions, the commander-in-chief announced that the defense forces in Donetsk region had liberated 3 villages. This is exactly the positive counteroffensive momentum I am talking about. But to get ahead of things, we shouldn't say that this is some kind of large-scale counteroffensive by the defense forces. No, that's not the case. These are exclusively local counteroffensive tactical actions by our troops aimed at improving their defensive positions. Because we know that the Donetsk direction, the Donetsk front, meaning Pokrovsk, Novopavlivka, will be reinforced, and this was previously announced by both Syrsky and the president. The Zaporizhia front area will also be reinforced, and there are currently no local counteroffensives, but such counteroffensives are taking place specifically in the Donetsk region. These counteroffensives are being carried out to improve our defensive positions and to strengthen our diplomatic and political standing. Counteroffensive actions are ongoing in the Sumy direction as well, where we also have advances, which I will talk about today. But I strongly urge and ask not to say that the Russians are trapped in some huge, gigantic encirclements or anything like that. That is not the case. The Russians aren't complete idiots either. In many of their operations, they fight with unprepared people, and frankly speaking, they fight poorly. They don't use their personnel properly at all. There are episodes where and by the way, the fact that they fight poorly, according to our soldiers, is a very, very big advantage for us, because with their numbers, it would be almost impossible to hold them back if they fought well. There are units that fight fantastically, excellently on the side of the Russian Federation, and they are concentrated in particular in Pokrovsk. I'm talking about unmanned units like Rubicon. And unfortunately, this is something the Russians are good at, and perhaps in some aspects, it's even worth learning from them. But overall, there isn't a situation of total victory or total defeat. Honestly, there are successes, local successes, and Syrsky talks about them, specifically naming the settlements that the defense forces managed to liberate in Donetsk region yesterday. These settlements are Mikhailivka, Zeleny High, and Volodymyrivka. A lot of media outlets publish this information without any reference to geolocation. But in reality, all 3 of these villages are located in completely different directions. Where? With what? So I actually suggest we figure this out now using the deep state map resource to see where all these villages are located. So let's start with Zeleny High. The news about his liberation has basically been circulating for the 3rd or 4th day now. The commander-in-chief only confirmed the fact that this village has been liberated. This is the Novopavlivka direction, just for context. This achievement actually happened last week. Zeleny High and the settlement of Tolstoy. These are the places our fighters from the 5th Separate Heavy Mechanized Brigade, the RDK, Russian Volunteer Corps, units of the Main Intelligence Directorate, the 37th Marine Brigade, and the 214th OP4 Battalion managed to secure. These are the ones that are known. Oh, and also the 67th Mechanized Brigade, among those known to be operating in this direction, managed to carry out counteroffensive actions in these areas, on these lines. In particular, the achievements specifically mentioned by the Commander-in-Chief regarding Zeleny High are thanks to the 37th Marine Brigade and the 214th Assault Regiment of OP4. So they showed a video, in fact, of the clearing operation they carried out on State Flag Day, although this happened a little earlier than August 23rd. Accordingly, our soldiers are unfurling the flags. And this isn't just some banal flag raising, it's a real clearing operation against the occupiers. Previously, quite a significant amount of work was done there to actually push Russian troops away from the borders between Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. So right now we can say that a number of fortified areas, Zeleny High, Tolstoy, and generally this whole area up to Iskra, or as it's now called here, the settlement of Iskra, or its current official name, Andriivka Klevtsov, this location, well, it's not yet completely under our total control. It's more of a large gray zone where, as I understand it, we don't have established ground positions, but there definitely isn't a consolidated enemy presence either. In a broader sense, as I see it, the task of our troops is to try to push the occupiers back to the Mokryali and Vovcha rivers in this direction. Right here, further on, flows the Mokryali River. At one time, it served as a dividing line in the direction of Velika Novosilka, and little by little, step by step, our troops are now trying to push the occupiers here. Why? In order to once again build better defensive positions before this direction is reinforced. After all, rivers, of course, make for a good line of combat engagement, good for control. Better than, for example, if it were to run somewhere through populated areas or in the middle of the steppe. A river is always best, even if it's not particularly deep or wide, because it allows for better organization of defense and makes it easier to detect the occupiers and their movements. Because in order to cross a river, you need to set up some kind of crossing or use boats to do it. This takes time, and that time is used to react and destroy them. It will be difficult. In reality, objectively, it will be difficult to push the Russians back to Mokryali in this direction. But potentially, from the perspective of preparing for further, more intense enemy pressure in this direction, this could be a theoretical objective. As for how to accomplish it, right now I'm just throwing out some options and making assumptions. On the other hand, further south in the Novopavlivka direction near Komishuvaka, unfortunately the enemy continues to advance. That is, this concerns Komishuvaka and Timirivka. This is already an attempt to enter the Dnipropetrovsk region from another flank, let's say, from the rear of the direction we've been discussing. It is quite possible that now there will simply be other local counteroffensive actions by the defense forces at various points. After all, the occupiers themselves, to be honest, are not having the best of times on the front right now either. Just look, they don't have any kind of total frenzied advance anywhere, even considering how many assaults they are carrying out on the front. Even taking into account that their losses have decreased now, they still are not achieving any significant successes anywhere, absolutely nowhere, and even their minor successes are basically amounting to nothing. And the task of our troops is essentially to try to make it so that for some individual villages, the Russians have to sacrifice thousands and thousands of their soldiers' lives so that these villages are eventually lost again, recaptured, lost again, and all their propaganda, well, would raise, questions, so to speak, or at least create some doubts within Russian society so that it doesn't form this concept of a total great victory and the advance of Russian troops. Even though they try to do all this, constantly writing to me here in reviews in the comments below, saying things like, well, Russian troops wanted a total settlement, which very often does not correspond to reality or is a premature claim, or in the end, even if they manage to capture some settlement, they later lose it. In short, what I'm getting at is that there are both advances and losses of territory. In the direction of Pokrovsk, Pokrovske, and Mirnohrad and Dobropilya, it's worth mentioning that last week I concluded my weekly review by saying that in this Dobropilya situation, it very much looks like the Russians have managed to relatively stabilize the situation by sending additional units here. Well, and Syrsky, by the way, the second settlement he mentions as having been liberated during these actions is Volodymyrivka, right here in this direction, precisely at the junction of the Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka directions. We'll see how the situation develops here, because over the weekend there was another very interesting story related to Mykolaiivka. This is the village of Mykolaiivka. It's near Mirnohrad, on the eastern outskirts of Mirnohrad. This situation was connected to the fact that the Russians showed a video where they were dropping munitions on our infantry. Unfortunately, we sometimes have to watch such videos as well. Here, it's important to understand the price at which these successes are achieved, the ones the Commander-in-Chief later spoke about, the ones we happily report in our reviews. This is also at the cost of Russian assault troops and infantry, on whom the Russians themselves are dropping munitions. And these drops, in fact, were recorded all the way on the eastern outskirts of Mykolaiivka, that is, roughly speaking, at these points, even on the other side of the Kazany Torets River. Essentially, roughly speaking, on the Dobropilya-Pokrovsk direction, which on the Novopavlivka axis is the objective, at least that's how it seems to me, that's how I interpret this objective, to establish a front along the Mokryali River. Here, the Kazany Torets River also flows through. and to return to the situation where the front will run along this river. This more or less is also, in my understanding, the current task of the defense forces. I think the enemy understands this objective as well. This is what our servicemen are currently doing, pushing Russian troops back behind a single clear watershed line. At present, it should be noted that counteroffensive actions are ongoing precisely in the Dobropilia-Pokrovsky direction. But here I will stop talking. I won't provide any additional information because this direction truly requires a certain level of silence. That's all I can say in this regard. By the way, just like Syrsky, this area was visited over the weekend by the commander of the National Guard, Alexander Pivnenko, because the units under his command are also responsible for the defense here. This includes the 14th National Guard Brigade Chervona Kalina. This is in fact the National Guard Corps of the NGU. The corresponding awards were presented to the soldiers by the commander of the NGU, Pivnenko. And through his words, in fact, some very interesting information was shared about the fact that since the beginning of the operation in Dobropilia, and let me remind you that our operation fully and completely unfolded on August 11th. So from then until today, in fact, over these 14 days, exactly 2 weeks, over these 2 weeks, Pivnenko reported that 1,100 occupiers were irreversibly eliminated. 1,100 occupiers with no return, meaning that's 100 occupiers killed. Another large number were wounded, approximately at least about the same number. And in total, we can talk about an entire brigade's worth of troops that the occupiers have lost here since the time of our local counteroffensive actions in the Dobropilia-Pokrovsk direction, which in principle is also a very good result. A very good result, but it should be taken into account that once again, I repeat the point I made at the beginning, there is no hyper-catastrophic situation for the Russians at the moment. We shouldn't paint fantastically large encirclements and similar things so that later we don't end up in psychological traps ourselves as a society. The third settlement that Syrsky mentioned was the village of Mikhailivka, as he named it. And then a bit of clarity was provided by the fighters of the Special Unit of the Defense Intelligence's Department of Active Operations and the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, which is part of the 3rd Army Corps. They are referring to the settlement of Novomikhailivka. This is also in the Donetsk region. Here we have Novomikhailivka, as you can see. And it was precisely this area that the Defense Intelligence fighters and the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade managed to clear together. They showed a video of the deployment of flags, the banners of the Art and Special Unit from the Department of Active Operations of the Defense Intelligence and the 3rd Assault Brigade. How did they carry all this out? They used drones to drive out the enemy there, destroyed them, and then proceeded to clear the area on foot, entering, capturing prisoners, and securing the village of Novomikhailivka. This is precisely in the Donetsk region. This is the northern part of Donetsk region, you could say in the Boriv direction, towards the settlement of Borova. This is where it happened. Recently, the Russians also posted videos showing how they drop munitions on our soldiers in the same way. At the very least, they are trying to hit our soldiers in Rakivka. Therefore, there is a high probability that Rakivka has also been liberated by our forces recently. By the way, if we return to Novomikhailivka, to the south of this settlement, right here, the soldiers are reporting that in Novomikhailivka alone, the enemy lost about a company of personnel and was forced to transfer reserves from other areas. In general, the story of transferring reserves is now quite common for the Russians. And this is actually a very good sign for us because even despite the large number of personnel, despite the overall saturation of their forces, which Syrsky mentioned earlier, plus 9,000 every month, the enemy still, it's not really explainable, but the fact is the enemy suffers from the quality of this personnel and is constantly forced to transfer units from one direction to another. In other words, they are experiencing certain shortages in terms of the style of attacks the enemy is conducting. They are already feeling certain shortages of personnel even now, because earlier we were informed that the Russians are now transferring their units from the Sumy region to other sections of the front. And as a result, what do we see? We see that our troops continue to advance in the Sumy region. An advance of about 1.5 to 2 kilometers in the area of Andriivka is what was marked on the deep state map. It is worth noting, of course, that these are not the most recent changes, not from yesterday, although they were recorded on the map of this analytical portal yesterday. But in general, there is a positive trend regarding the movement of our troops toward the state border. Now, in my opinion, Sumy region has already become, for the occupiers, a bit of a suitcase without a handle because you can't advance to Sumy and you can't establish fire control over Sumy. Any territorial claims or encroachments on the Sumy region, it sounds ridiculous. In negotiations, the Sumy region no longer comes up as any kind of serious argument. You can't even stir up panic among the civilian population. So it's hard to understand what the Russians are supposed to do with this now. Little by little, Sumy region and this patch of Russian presence are turning into the same kind of quagmire as the areas of Vovchansk and Lipsy, where the Russians can't really leave, but it's also very hard to hold because all the fortifications there have been completely destroyed and they just have to keep sending their troops in. There's a similar area here in the Tyotkino district, which they should probably abandon, but how can they leave it if it's part of the Kursk region? So the Russians have created several such locations for themselves at once. They simply can't abandon these places politically, but to be honest, there's really no military purpose in holding on to them. There is significant destruction happening there, and these territories are simply not worth holding, but they keep holding on to them anyway. Well, we'll see how the situation develops here. At the moment, in the Sumy region, right here in this particular area, we are seeing successes. This is thanks to the 225th Assault Regiment. But let me return to the area where the previously accumulated successes of the enemy have started to turn into very significant gradual problems for us. Right now, I am talking about the Lyman front area, and this advance in the Serebryanske forestry, from which the enemy has almost completely pushed out our units, but is still not fully able to accomplish this.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
This is the complete establishment of the front along the Zherebets River. Here the Zherebets River flows. It then flows into the Siversky Donets. The Siversky Donets is this river here, one of the largest rivers in Ukraine. If I'm not mistaken, it's the fourth largest in terms of water volume and size in Ukraine. Here it flows. This obstacle is natural. It was an obstacle that prevented, let me label it like this. This is SD, Siversky Donets, and this will be SD, and this will be the letter ZH for the Zherebets River. So the Siversky Donets has prevented the occupiers from crossing this water barrier since 2022. This is actually a very difficult water obstacle to overcome. Although the Russians tried in 2022 to send their troops across both in the Serebryanka area, in the Bilohorivka area, and, by the way, here in the Shipilivka area as well, they still couldn't manage to do it. Our artillery would simply destroy them as soon as these crossings were being built. Now the war has changed a little. Now no one is moving tanks across the river crossings anymore, or at least they don't see it as possible to do so in the near future. Everyone has switched mostly to fighting with drones, although artillery still plays its part. Rocket forces have their own significance, but overall such heavy equipment is no longer being moved across rivers. However, due to the occupation of these locations in the Serebryanske forestry, the Russians now have the opportunity to influence the other bank of the Siversky Donets River, targeting Serebryanka and Dronivka, cutting off their connections and, of course, starting battles for one of our main fortified areas, immovable and untouched since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, which is the settlement of Siversk. This is one of the problems we have here in the Lyman direction. The second problem we have here in Lyman, once again, even though I've already erased all the markings, I'll mark where the Zherebets River flows. So here it is, and this is the Siversky Donets for us, just schematically. Accordingly, where the Zherebets is, the Russians have already occupied almost the entire left bank of the Zherebets in the area of the Torska River, the settlement of Torska, as you can see, and are gradually moving to the other bank here. Right here is the settlement of Zarishne. This is essentially the gateway to the settlement of Lyman. Currently, fighting is also ongoing on the road between Zarishne and Yampil. In other words, the occupiers are trying to establish themselves already on the right bank of Zarishne. Our troops will undoubtedly try to continue holding the defense along the Zherebets River, at least in this direction, although this may not be an easy task because the Russians objectively have certain successes here. They have already been spotted in Zarechne, even infantrymen, and efforts are being made to deal with this. In particular, credit should be given to the fighters of the 63rd Separate Mechanized Brigade, the Steel Lions. Their tanks are especially effective at taking out the occupiers there, but the situation is extremely tense. That is to say, we unfortunately risk very soon seeing direct and intense battles for the strategically important cities of Lyman and for Yampil. Of course, to some significant extent, fighting is already actively ongoing, both for the crucial city of Lyman and for Siversk. These two main and vital fortified areas of ours in the northern part of the Donbas region may very soon become the primary sites of extremely intense and prolonged fighting. And finally, I would like to talk about the Zaporizhzhia direction, because there are also certain threats there. I have already reported about them earlier. It's worth highlighting them again, because over the weekend, the enemy's advances were visualized in the area of, Plavny and Kamyanske. These are the two locations where the enemy advanced. Well, there's nothing surprising about that. After capturing Kamyanske, the Russians are trying to break through towards Stepnohirsk. In other words, that's their number one objective. They are aiming to take Stepnohursk, which is under the control of our forces, because it's an elevation that allows, basically, it's a location that enables influence both on Zaporizhzhia and, in the future, on the logistics of the Orikhiv direction. The Russians are not above advancing towards Stepnohursk now, and just as they previously moved across the fields, now they are also moving along the former shoreline of the reservoir through Plavny and settlements like Primorske. They are similarly aiming to capture Stepnohursk. They are even using the former territory of the reservoir, which is now overgrown with trees and bushes, to sneak into Primorske. Primorske is quite an interesting settlement for us. I'll show you now precisely what it looks like. It has a very densely built up area right here, as you can clearly see on this prominent protrusion here. And this is exactly the strategic location where the enemy is actively trying to break in. Recently, a location was recorded where the enemy was already concentrating in Primorske, and at first they tried to drive them out with drones. It didn't work. Then a heavy aerial bomb hit, destroying all the occupiers there. I suggest we watch this on video. This is OSINT. As you can see, it shows that the Russians have reached the direction of Primorske. And then our aerial shell hits there, wiping out the occupiers completely, reducing them to zero. Where did this happen? This happened right at this point in Primorske near the lake. And there's a lake here, and behind it the houses begin. A densely populated area, so to speak. And it is here that the occupiers are now actively moving in, trying to gain a foothold so they can later put pressure on Stepnohursk. Stepnohursk is of interest to them for two reasons, which analysts from Deep State recently discussed in more detail in their conclusions. From Stepnohursk, you can reach the southern outskirts of Zaporizhzhia. It's about 20 to 25 kilometers from here. From here, you can influence the Orikhiv-Zaporizhzhia highway, particularly in the direction of Komishuvaka. Here is this highway, here it stretches out. Well, it seems I can't manage to draw anything. So this isn't working. All right, okay. Aha, I see why it's not working. One more time. From the Stepnohursk area, you can influence Zaporizhzhia and also Komishuvaka, as well as the highway. The highway runs right here. This whole stretch is the Komishuvaka highway and the settlement of Orikhiv. Here is Orikhiv. So accordingly, if the Russians potentially take Stepnohursk, they will be able to affect logistics, and in the future, they will be able to build up their attacks in the Orikhiv direction, influence Zaporizhzhia, and carry out various terrorist attacks. Right now, they are actively engaged in trying to capture Stepnohursk. Here, they are actively using the already well-known tactics of so-called sleeping drones, which they first started using in the Kursk region. What is a sleeping drone? A drone, they set up ambushes with drones targeting our logistics. This is when a drone, usually fiber optic, it has to be a drone, it lands and stays grounded in an area, well, at known, frequently used or important intersections or locations where the occupiers are certain our vehicles will pass. And when such vehicles or any other equipment, whether lightly or heavily armored, pass by, the drone quickly takes off and strikes. These kinds of drone ambushes, analysts from Deep State have also shown their own photos and videos of how they happen in the Stepnohursk direction. Let's call it that. These so-called waiting drones are being used by the occupiers there. So in reality, there is currently no large-scale offensive in the entire Zaporizhzhia region, as was expected. But in terms of the local situation around the settlement of Stepnohursk, the situation here has indeed become extremely complicated lately. And this is precisely the location where the enemy is focusing most of its attention among all the Zaporizhzhia or southern directions. That's the situation at the front, friends. I'll wrap things up here. We've already been talking for quite a while. But really, as I have said, and as I warned you, there's a lot of news, so it takes a lot of time and a lot of explanations. Thank you for your attention. Take care of yourselves, dear friends. Please like, leave comments, and subscribe to us. All the best, and see you next time.